Hello, James here. This is part 4 of our tutorial series on the Autco Medicom system. And today we're going to be talking about zone and bind. So, what are zones? Zones, if you go into the zone and bind and zone table, you have all these which are created by default from the template. You have a Z1, zone 1, up to Z14. So one for each console. And I suggest that you ignore for now the zone R1, R2. That's the rosters, and it's a more advanced feature which we might talk about later. So for now, let's look what's already inside zone 1. So inside this zone edit, zone 1, you have here S alarm console buzzer 1. This console buzzer 1 represents the console number 1, whatever's going to be displayed on the console number 1. And all of these, you don't need to know actually what they are, but they are all here by default inside the zone edit for the node 1. And let's look into the bind. By default, you have one bind for each console. So let's go into bind 1. This is there by default, and by default bind 1 has input group 1. That's all the calls it takes from, which is all the calls in group 1, and it sends it to the zone. Now let's ignore this part here and focus on Z1, which is what we've just seen. Z-1 is in the zone table right here, which is what we've just seen. And what's inside Z-1? You have the console and several other things. But the most important thing by default is the console there. So B1 has bound group 1 to Z1, to the zone 1. And what's inside group 1? What's inside this? You have to go into the call group, and what's inside group 1 is what we've selected. So remember, in the very first movie, we've selected all 16 calls from node 1 to 16, and we've added them into group 1. And that's the reason why, after creating our 16 calls here and then putting those 16 calls into group 1, it would make the calls be displayed on the console. The reason why we have that is that by default we already have bind 1, which takes group 1 and sends it to zone 1. And inside zone 1 we have the console number 1. So that's the reason why, after putting the calls inside group 1, it would automatically make those calls be displayed on the console. If I were to delete this default zone 1, or if I were to delete this default bind 1, the calls will no longer be displayed there. So this is where we would go if we wanted to do a lot of transfers. So let's, for example, go into the call table and create a few more call points. And let's say they are call points for node 2. and I would choose the options appropriately. ARM calls, and let's see, let's create 16 calls for node 2. All right, and let's say that there are 2 special calls in node 2, and let's say we call them special 1 and special 2. So all calls from node 2, what we want to do is to make them be displayed on node 2. So what we do is that we go again into the call group, and this time we go into node 2, group 2, and we select all the C02s. Now a shortcut would be to have word 2 and select all in the same place, because when we created those calls in node 2, we added place word 2 here. But that's just a shortcut. You don't have to do it. Otherwise, you would have to go into this group and select them all one by one. So after you put them into node 2, then just like in node 1, just like for group 1, you would have the default bind 2, which associates group 2 with zone 2, and what's inside zone 2 is the console number 2. So usually you would not edit those default zones. Leave them like this. But let's say that in our call table, remember those 2 special calls that we have on node 2? Let's say, for example, that we want those 2 calls to be displayed both on node 2, which it already is because it's been put inside group 2, but we also want those 2 to be displayed on node 1, so which is sort of like a transfer. Because they are special, we want them to appear on both consoles. There are several ways to do that. So one way is to simply go into the bind, and since the special calls are in node 2, they are already being displayed on node 2. So we don't need to modify anything for those to be displayed on node 2. We could go into bind 1, and instead of just having group 1, we could add an input, and if you remember, the 2 special calls are the last 2, and we could add those 2 here. Press OK, and you can see them. They are added here, and those 2 calls are associated with Z1, which contains the console display. So with that, the 2 special calls are also going to be displayed on console number 2. Now that's one way to do this, and I wouldn't say this is the best way. Personally, I would do it another way. So I'm going to delete these 2 here, and what I'm going to do is to create a new bind. Let's say we call it b-special, or you should choose a name that makes sense. So let's say b-special, and we edit it. We add the input, the 2 here, and we add a zone Z1, and like that, those 2 inputs are going to be associated with Z1, And Z1 contains the console number 1 as well as many other things that are there by default. So this is a second way to make those calls be displayed on console 1. But that is not the only way neither. So that's the second way. Let's delete this and I'll show you even a third way. The third way would be to go into the zone table and then create a new zone. Let's call it Z-special. Okay, and Z-special, we want to have S-alarm publisher console buzzer 1, which represents the console number 1. Alright, we created the Z-special, and notice that inside Z-special we only have the console display 1. We don't have the rest. We don't have the rest of these. So after creating Z-special, we go into bind and we go back into we create another bind V-special and we add the input and V-special at the zone Z-special. Now the advantage of this is that everything looks, you're not modifying any of the default ones here. All the default ones, they stay default, and you just add new binds, new zones, and you don't get to modify the default ones. A lot of times many technicians would expect the default ones to be to stay default. So if you want to do some special transfers, perhaps a good solution is to always create your new a new bind, at least a new bind. Perhaps the zone, you don't need to create a new zone. You can just use Z-1 if you want to inside this. Instead of this Z-special, you would use Z-1 like in the second solution. Personally, I think that the second solution would be the better one, because you would have this a new bind, but you wouldn't need this new zone. And let's verify that everything is still fine here by generating the node file, and it says all files generated, which means that there's no error. So I just showed you many ways to make call transfers and also the concept of zone and bind. So you would have to get used to it, because these are fairly complicated concepts.